This is Guardian Radio 96.9 FM, Nassau, Bahamas.
The views and opinions of the hosts and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the position of the management and staff of Guardian Network. There you go for all of my Baptist young people. And for those of you who used to be Baptist young people, I don't know if you guys remember the Bahamas Baptist Mass Youth Choir. Those were the days. That's the New Jersey Mass Choir singing I'll Tell It, something that goes back to the time when a number of us were young and skinny, and when there were, well, let's just leave it at young and skinny, and we'll stick with that. Thank you very much for joining me, as usual, on this wonderful Sunday afternoon. You are tuned into Guardian Talk Radio 96.9 FM. This view, I am your host, Quincy Parker, and normally at this point, I would sort of get into a little bit of a soliloquy about how things are going in the country, how things are going, in my life and in the life of my family and friends. But something happened this week that threw me for a loop, and I just want to say, hold your loved ones close. My friend Chris Mortimer died in circumstances that I don't yet understand, and I just want to say you are. I mean, it's something that people say all the time. No man is promised tomorrow, and that is very true. I met Chris a long time ago. And I watched him do the Democratic National Alliance. He was the quiet power behind the scenes in the early days of the DNA, one of the architects of that third wave. He was, of course, well-respected businessman, but I knew him also later on as a musician and a record producer, wannabe record producer, who was doing some really good work, and he was following his dreams, and I can't tell you how much I respect the willingness to toss caution to the wind and chase down what it is you dream about doing. And so, you know, it's a thing that I've tried to do in my own life. And I encouraging all of you who are, you know, listening to me today, those of you who will listen on the podcast, those of you who are joining us through Guardian Talk Radio online. Number one, hold your loved ones close. And number two, chase your dreams. You only have one life, so you might as well live the life you want to live. You might as well be who you want to be. These things that are wrapped up inside you, they're there for a reason. You should bring them out and display them for the world to see. What's the worst that could happen? Somebody doesn't like it, so what? Nobody likes it, so what? Follow your dreams. Be yourself. Be true to yourself. I hope somebody hears me, and I hope they live. I hope you all live as Chris lives, chasing your dreams, doing what you were meant to do. Today, I'm excited about the show because we have one of my favorite guests back today. But, the Bahamas is wrestling with what seems like increasingly intractable national debt. And this new budget sort of goes only so far in terms of addressing the underlying causes of that debt. And we're forced to once again ask the question, where is the innovation? What creative solutions are being implemented? What unexplored roads are suddenly being considered? And are those roads, if they exist, are they wise? So as we're looking for new and lasting solutions to the debt threatening to slip out of our control, it behooves us to examine the neighbors have done and how well the innovations they've tried have worked. Last week, Prime Minister Philip Davis presented his administration's 23-24 budget, and I want to consider the PM's comments on government financing as sort of a background for our discussion today. He reported that the Bahamas' borrowing costs rose at the end of March 2023. In fact, at the end of the third quarter, the total average borrowing cost for current outstanding debts had risen to an interest rate of 5.55%, which is, as the PM pointed out, notably higher than the previous year's rate of 4.93% at the end of March 2022. The increase in borrowing costs is primarily attributable, according to the PM, to the higher costs associated with external loan facilities. Davis specified that the average interest rate for external financing has risen to 1.99 basis points, which is a huge rise in an interest rate. And that has resulted in the rate of 5.55% as compared to the preceding year's rate. And in order to deal with managing government debt, one of the strategies the Prime Minister is contemplating is the debt for nature swap. Now today, my guest will talk about the various considerations surrounding debt for nature and its innovation. And we're really looking forward to that conversation. But sort of as some context for us, a look at what a debt for innovation swap is. It involves restructuring sovereign debt in exchange for the debtor's investment in nature conservation. These instruments promise a win-win for economies and the environment, in some instances through the use of what have come to be called blue bonds. Now, you may remember that term because PM talked a lot about blue bonds last year. And we did some shows here on what blue bonds are and the fact that Barbados most recently did a blue bond, We also mentioned Belize. And sort of as a refresher for that, Belize, this is how Belize did it. And it's kind of complicated. So try to follow this. It begins with the Belize Blue Investment Company, an entity of the Nature Conservancy, which is an international nonprofit dedicated to conservation and environmental preservation efforts. So this entity and Credit Suisse held Belize's national debt because of an arrangement to loan Belize $364 million, conditional on Belize making new commitments to invest in marine ecosystems. So the BBIC and Credit Suisse then issue the blue bonds to pass along Belize's unappealing debt to diverse new owners. The U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, or the IDFC, de-risked the previously unattractive blue bond saleable to investors by insuring them. So because these bonds are now insured by the IDFC, if Belize fails to pay up, the U.S. government will step in. Then investors, because the debt is now much more attractive, buy Belize's restructured debt in the form of the de-risked blue bonds, so named because they are related to marine conservation. And that is the complicated process of the debt for nature swap that Belize did. Barbados did it after Belize, and there are other countries around the world who have done this. Seychelles, Poland, and others are contemplating making use of this tool. But about a month ago, Kevin Bender, the Senior Director of Sustainable Debt at the Nature Conservancy, the Honorable Christopher Koye, Minister of State in the Ministry of Finance, Economic Development and Investment in the government, and Jill Doshi, founder and CEO of the Potomac Group LLC, discussed debt for nature swaps as a tool for funding biodiversity efforts at speed and scale with Natasha White from Bloomberg. I guess you can't even really call Bloomberg a magazine anymore. It's an organization. This is a discussion of the Belize debt for nature swap. And I think it's really interesting and worth us listening to the discussion. It runs for a bit, but I really think we should pay attention to some of the ins and outs, especially where it comes to what Belize had to do in order to make this blue bond work. Chris, if you would.
So, Christopher, what was the economic outlook for Belize in late 2020, and why did you look favorably upon a debt for nature swap against other options on the table?
Well, economic outlook was certainly grim. We were in a deep crisis, fiscal, economic, debt crisis. The economy had already been in contraction at the time of COVID, but COVID simply exacerbated that situation where we were contracting around 13%, not unlike many other countries, but for us it was certainly difficult. We were already in debt distress before COVID, and COVID only made it far more worse. Our debt to GDP ratio had increased to around 133%, one of the highest in the entire Western Hemisphere. And altogether, our revenue, government's revenue suffered a fiscal shortfall of around 30%. We had to keep spending for pandemic-related expenditures. The net result was that we were suffering an overall deficit of double digits. The unemployment rate approached close to 30%. Rate was in excess of 50%. So certainly we didn't have much choice but to look at how we restructure our debt, among other other things that would put us back on a good footing so far as fiscal consolidation was concerned.
And why did you look towards a debt for nature swap? So to address both the debt component, but also nature protection in the country. Why was that a favorable option for you?
Well, we have had a pre-existing relationship with the TNC for many years, for decades. I think the first debt for nature swap that TNC did was actually with Belize about 20 years prior. And TNC had, over the many years, expressed an interest in doing a larger deal with Belize. A new government at the time, in late 2020, it was imperative that we take immediate action in debt restructuring. And so looking at what our debt position was at the time, we felt that we had to negotiate with our external. It was a sizable portion of our overall debt. So we started that process immediately. And at the same time, on a parallel basis, then we initiated negotiations with the TNC to look at how they could play a role in our overall debt restructuring process.
Okay. And Kevin, what were the key ingredients you needed to pull this off? And the Belize deal was not only the largest, but it also involved some novelties to these kind of debt for nature swaps that have been around for a while, in the sense that it opened it up to a pool of institutional investors, so pension funds and others. What were the key ingredients you needed to make that work, and what were the challenges that you faced in doing so?
Sure, thanks, and thank you for inviting us here today, and Bloomberg for hosting this. This was an evolution of the debt for nature swap, which had been around and started in the 1980s, was popular in the 1990s and 2000s, and as Minister Coy said, TNC did their first with Belize, so in 2001, and we had this 3-decade relationship with Belize. We did a transaction in the Seychelles, which was kind of a half step in 2016, which was profiling the Paris Club loans to the Seychelles. But what we discovered in that transaction was that getting the discount or the haircut was difficult to do, and it was a long negotiation with the bilateral creditors. And yet we could find that discount readily available in the capital markets with the bonds. So we started putting together a program to figure out how we could work on credit-enhancing bonds to buy back bonds at a discount, and then using that savings to finance the conservation that the countries wanted to achieve. We worked with a few countries, and what you need is we were exploring with a few countries, and we had spent a long time working with the Development Finance Corporation of the United States to set up the credit enhancement. We had already tendered out for the investment bank to do the arranging, and Credit Suisse had won that before we even started the Belize transaction. But with our relationship and with the Belize currently, at the time, was in negotiations with their bondholders, and their bonds were trading at a deep discount, we saw a great opportunity to bring all of these parts together. And was that Belize, because of our relationship with Belize, we knew that Belize had high ambitions for conservation and a high commitment. If you look at Belize and how much they've committed on the forest side, TNC has been involved in that, and they had the commitments on the conservation commitment desires on the ocean side. So we had already made great progress on that, right? Because that is outside of the financing, but needs to go into the loan documentation. So everything kind of came together. And then there was an election in Belize, and a new administration had come in, and that's when we started working on that. Now, we really had serious conversations starting in January of 2001, and then we closed the transaction in early November.
Okay. And Jill, Belize was in debt distress at the time. The Nature Conservancy has since done a similar deal in Barbados, which wasn't in debt distress. There's been some discussion around whether debt for nature swaps are best suited to countries that are in debt distress or countries that are not in distress situations. Could you just talk a bit about your views there and how that debate lies?
No, absolutely. So, first of all, I'd like to say that the IMF has recently come out with a paper that said that there are 59 countries that are most vulnerable to climate change. And of those, 34 countries are also at high risk of debt distress. And so the coming together of these two crises is well known. And the countries themselves are starting to organize. And they're starting to say that we need to solve these crises simultaneously. So we already have an organization called V20, which is the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which now has 58 countries, about 2 billion people in its population. We have the Sustainable Debt Coalition that was announced by Egypt at COP27. And we have the Bridgetown Initiative coming out of Barbados. And so countries themselves are linking these issues and are pushing the international community to think about it in this way. And they have been saying very much that the situation is getting worse. The vulnerabilities are increasing. The uncertainties in the market, particularly with geopolitical tensions, the war in Ukraine, food insecurity, rising interest rates. We need to think creatively about these solutions. And so the Belize transaction really starts to point a way forward of saying this is what ways that we can think creatively and bring in these innovations. And then the challenge is how to scale it. And at the same time, our frameworks for debt restructuring, particularly the G20 Common Framework, are also trying to figure out how to mobilize climate finance to scale and to meet our commitments of advanced economies. We're also at the same time trying to rewrite those frameworks. So kind of bringing these together makes sense. But just also, whether you're a country in distress or not in distress, the fundamentals of debt management are that you're trying to either raise finance for new projects and new investments, or you're trying to refinance existing debt. And you're trying to do that at a lower cost and at lower risk. And so that's meaning lower coupons, longer maturities, ideally in local currency, and ideally you're also addressing counterparty risk so that if you are in debt distress, you have the ability to negotiate with your creditors and reach a solution, a resolution. And these structures that we're talking about today actually address all of those issues. And so they're quite powerful tools to have in the toolbox, not yet be the solution that solves everything of either climate finance or debt distress, but it is certainly a very powerful tool to be using, particularly with certain creditors or creditor groups that might be particularly difficult or negotiations that are stalled. So I think these are not exclusively for debt distress situations, but they can definitely be used in all situations where, as Kevin says, you have that discount in the market, because it's really that's driving the kind of ability to capture that fiscal space for investment in climate.
Okay. And Christopher, a year and a half in, how's it going? What impacts have you seen, both in terms of on your finances and also in terms of conservation projects?
Well, first I would say that the transaction, the Belize deal, tool used out of a toolkit. It was part of our overall recovery plan. We restructured other debt as well. We restructured recently our Venezuela debt. We also had restructured our Taiwan debt. And through that process, we were able to reduce our debt to GDP ratio from the 133% that I had initially indicated to you to 64%. So whereas after the transaction, the IMF had indicated that it was an important step for Belize, our debt was still unsustainable at the time. Their most recent Article 4 consultation, they have indicated that no, Belize's debt is now sustainable. So it's been a dramatic turnaround for our economy, our fiscal finances over the past couple of years. Our economy has grown over 28% over the 2 years, 15% in 21, another 12% in 2022. Our unemployment rate is from the 30% that I mentioned is now down at an all-time low of 5%. We have broadened our economy in terms of diversification of our sectors and our estimates of all the MDBs, including the IMF. Notwithstanding the challenges in inflation and supply chain and all those issues, we're doing a lot better. Our debt, in terms of the transaction itself, we had reduced our overall debt by 12%. So it was a significant immediate impact. Our debt servicing obligations in the near term, as a result of the transaction structure, meant that our debt servicing reduced on just the external commercial debt, whereas it was roughly $28 million in pure interest debt that had reduced to around, I think, 10 million, a little over 10 million. So that fiscal space certainly made a significant difference in our fiscal position. At the same time, though, I have to underscore that it's a financial deal. It's not just the financial partners that made that deal. The government had to play a key role in exercising political will, fiscal discipline, and fiscal consolidation. It meant expenditure containment, which involved cutting public sector wages at 10%. We had strikes as a result of that, but we followed through, maintained our position, and that built credibility for Belize in the decision making that it went through in terms of that transaction, but showing to the not only local but the international community what the government is prepared to do and to stick to enable not only this transaction to occur, but enable investment confidence to reemerge.
Okay.
Can I just add?
Sure.
So, but I think the interesting thing is there is a debate whether the debt conversions work with a debt workout. But what Belize has done is prove that it can, but in a slow, much easier situation where it's not like a common framework where everybody's trying to solve one problem at a time. But it definitely worked well, and as the minister said, we reduced the debt 12% of GDP overnight in that transaction. So it was an immediate step. It's one solution. So it's great to see that the debt management units of the ministries of finance have this tool in their toolbox. But there have been many successes on the conservation side because we do not see this as a liability management tool. This is a conservation funding tool, right? So we're trying to help governments achieve the conservation commitments that they want to do and then for those commitments. And we worked with Belize years before, so we understood what they were trying to achieve. But we do put that into the loan agreement, and that helps us get the credit enhancement, and that also helps with the end investors, feel that these are not just plain vanilla sovereign bonds, but they're actually achieving the conservation. Those commitments are made and are time bound, and if they're not made, then there's an additional payment that they have to pay while they're outstanding. That money doesn't go to the bondholders or anything, it just goes back. But those commitments have been met, so far on time without problems, and they were starting the Marine Spatial Plan, establishing a conservation trust fund to disperse these. The Conservation Trust Fund has dispersed 2 rounds and just announced yesterday a larger significant round of programs that will be funded. And then there were even some specifics of designation of mangroves into public lands, and those have all been met on time.
Okay. So you've seen some kind of material change on the ground in terms of improving or protecting the marine space.
If I can add from a conservation standpoint, what Kevin spoke to, one of the big milestones that we have achieved already is in terms of the biodiversity zones. We have increased that from 15% to 20%. We've committed to increase to 30% by 2026. And that somewhat highlights part of the importance of an alignment in terms of government goals or the country's goals. Belize is certainly very conservation-oriented, and we had already committed to 30% of our ocean waters being protected by diversity zones. We only, under this arrangement, moved it up to from 20 to 26, but it was a part of our commitment, and I think that is important that in transactions like these, that there are these commitments or objectives that form part of the overall policy of the country, so that it makes it easier to happen. It wasn't hard for us to make those commitments because those were our goals already.
Yeah. Okay, Jill, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that point as well, is that one of the really powerful outcomes of these sorts of transactions is this alignment of government between the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Environment and Fisheries and Labor and Energy, et cetera. I mean, it just really drives that interministerial coordination and actually increases governance, because you're also putting in targets, you're setting performance KPIs, and then as you're meeting those, there's all sorts of monitoring and reporting and verification. So there's actually a virtuous cycle that can be developed through these transactions. And you're also, and we were talking about it just actually before, creating a different narrative for the country. And it's particularly for those countries that are in some sort of distress, whether it's in a negotiation or just in a kind of market, the bond prices, you're changing the dynamic of the conversation, where instead of just talking about the difficulties that the country's having, you're taking ownership of it and talking about something that's positive and investing in building resilience, building sustainability, and the future of the country. And so I think that's a very interesting dynamic out of these transactions that is quite powerful for any country, whether in distress or otherwise.
Yeah, okay. I'm conscious we've got the time's speeding by. I think before we wrap up, I would just like to get your response to some criticism that's emerged. The deal was kind of widely welcomed and has been heralded for its innovation, but there has been some criticism around both the costs associated with the and the transparency around those, and secondly, around the labelling of the bonds at the top of the crediting structure as blue, when not 100% of the proceeds are going towards marine projects, which is the kind of norm in the sort of green bond market. How do you respond to those couple of points there? And I'd like that to open that up to all of you. But Kevin, perhaps we can start with you.
Let's see. Well, there's two issues there. One, I'll quickly start with my responses. Of the first one is it a blue bond? And the blue bonds are not quite as defined as green bonds, right? So if it were a green bond, they're what's called a use of proceeds bond, in which all of the financing would go towards projects in climate or nature, or ocean in our case. There are guidelines on the blue bonds, but those came out after our transaction that the IFC has, and ICMA, I believe, is working on it, but there's no standard. So if there is an agreed global standard on what a blue bond is and we don't fit with that, then we will adapt. And we are actually changing ours to nature bonds, because now we're working with terrestrial and freshwater as well as oceans. But it's clear that the proceeds are used mainly to repurchase the debt and retire that debt and replace it, reprofile it with a loan. And then finally on that, we're not worried about that with the investor class. If these were retail products that were being sold to families, that would be a problem. But by law, with these private placement, qualified institutional buyers who are very sophisticated, asset managers, insurance companies, banks, and we know all of the individuals who made those decisions. They grilled us deeply on the conservation and the structure. I don't feel that there is any chance that anybody was misled as to what we were doing with those, because the analysis that goes into purchasing these bonds is rather intensive. On the cost side, there are two types of costs. There's the fixed costs of the upfront costs, and I think those are pretty standard with any sovereign issue, right? You have lawyers, you have arrangers, you have SPV creation and the like. I don't see that as any different than what they would have done with a workout with their new structure. On the running costs, which is the spread between the blue bonds and the blue loan, that's composed of many things. The key one is the political risk insurance that we needed to put on the principal and the interest of this transaction. So that is the bulk of the spread, and that you can look at that as a cost because Belize's borrowing cost in the market at the time, not that they were traded actively,
20%.
Yeah, it was up near high teens and close to 20%. Where in the end they ended up borrowing close to just a little over 6%. So that is a massive savings for a small amount of cost. So it is a big pickup, but it is a cost. It's a cost that is common in structured products. There are other costs that, underwriting costs, for instance, that Belize, because of the negotiation, Belize had agreed with all of their bondholders that they would accept something, which means they had to finance all of their bondholders, and they needed to have it underwritten by Credit Suisse and did not take the risk of issuing the market. So these are acceptable costs they have to be in these structures, and we're doing everything we can to make those costs as efficient as possible, but this was the first transaction, and Belize really led the way on the market.
If I can highlight one item in terms of costs, the reference to the political risk insurance and the DFC, I think that in itself actually is one of the insights that we can offer from this Belize deal, that credit enhancements are a critical part in all these debt distress transactions, risk reduction strategies, one of which is credit enhancement. And if there's a learning that we can have going forward, it is the importance or value of that and how developed countries can play a role in supporting debt distress transactions through providing risk reduction strategies like credit enhancements that the DFC did provide in our case.
I totally agree with that. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thanks to the three of you. I think we're at time.
That's good, Chris. Right there is good. Thank you very much for playing that, and I hope you were able to listen to what was said there. That was, in my view, a really great explanation of how Belize went through its process. And I have some questions for our guest based on some of the things that were said there. But those questions will wait until we come back from this break. On the other side of the break, I've already told you who it is. If you were following me on Facebook or Twitter, you know who's on the other side of this break. And if not, I'll keep you in suspense for just a few more minutes. We'll be right back. You're tuned into the Political Review with K. Quincy Parker on Guardian Talk Radio 96.9 FM. We'll be right back.
Boy, you know what going down tomorrow?
No, what happening?
Joe bringing these knives to school. He could do Junior in.
For what?
Boy, he fooled with Joe girl.
Mother sick. And you know Junior don't back down for nothing. So that means you got a big fight tomorrow.
So whose side you on?
Side? I trying to stay in school, not Simpson Penn. We gotta tell somebody about this fight.
Tell somebody? I ain't no snitch. I mean cool, you know.
Boy, if you so cool, then you need to stay in school and stay out of the fight.
Yeah, but if I don't hang on Joe's side, how many boys coming for me next?
Alright, so we definitely gotta tell somebody. We gotta prevent the fight.
What I say, I don't want nobody call me snitch.
We could just call Crime Stoppers. You could report what you know, and nobody gotta know it's you.
So what are the boy?
All you gotta do is call them, or you text them through the Crack Crime Bahamas app, and nobody can know it's you.
Then the police come looking for me for more info, and when they finish with them, Joe them coming looking for me?
When you call Crime Stoppers, the calls go directly to Miami, and they don't ask nothing about you. Then you can get the pen from them, and you can claim a reward later using that same pen.
Plus, everything's scrambled, so nobody can read what you're saying.
Call 328-8477 from Nassau or 242-300-8477 from the Family Islands.
Have you taken a look at those investment options yet?
Too busy. Look at today. Workout, breakfast, drop kids at school, back-to-back meetings, dog from the groomer, nails. And that's all before 12. How come you're so chill?
That's because my money is as busy as you.
At RF, we find the best Bahamian and international investments to keep your money busy so you can spend more time focusing on you. Contact us at rfgroup.com to find out more. RF, money at work.
Love the show? Want to give your support? Become a sponsor today. Call 302-2300 for our rates and packages. That's 302-2300. Become a sponsor on Guardian Radio 96.9 FM. Fresh news, smart talk, all day.
This is Guardian Radio 96.9 FM. Fresh news, smart talk, all day.
We're back in with the old New Jersey Mass Choir. It's a standard. It's beautiful. It makes me smile. It reminds me of my youth. And Siri, I don't need you. Thank you very much. The beautiful thing about life is that we have the opportunity every day to do something new, or the opportunity to do something that we didn't get to do yesterday. Last week, I was excited to share a conversation with our next guest. And this week, it didn't happen last week for some reason. This week, we were able to wash that disappointment free from our souls. And joining us now to talk about the various considerations surrounding the Debt for Nature swap, and whether or not it is author, international economist, former International Monetary Fund and World Bank Group big shot, Bahamian at large, and consultant Therese Turner-Jones. Therese, hello.
Hi, Quincy. How are you? Happy Sunday.
Happy Sunday to you as well.
Such a nice day, right? It's a good time to chill and reflect. So I love being here today.
Yeah. I am chilling like a villain, as they say. But I know I only have a short time with you today, so I'm motoring straight ahead. About 3 weeks ago, a month ago now, Ecuador struck the world's largest ever Debt for Nature swap to protect the Galapagos Islands. And the deal is worth about $1 billion in Ecuador's national debt. And in exchange for the loan, Ecuador will pump about $12 million a year until 2041 into conservation efforts in the Galapagos, which is one of the world's most precious. I want to play this 2-minute clip from the Climate Fund managers, which helped to seal the deal. And then after that, I'd like to ask you some questions. Is that all right?
That sounds great.
Excellent. Christopher, let's get that second clip, please.
Our latest project is a debt for climate conversion that will preserve one of the planet's most vital ecosystems for generations, the Galapagos Islands. Situated in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Ecuador, the Galapagos are a marvel of biodiversity. Their remote, isolated location and unique geography has made them home to the world's largest number of endemic species, those found nowhere else on the planet. The Galapagos are surrounded by 200,000 square kilometers of marine protected areas. Enforcing their protected status is challenging. Overfishing, climate change, and pollution have put the fragile ecosystem and the communities that depend on it at risk. Debt for climate conversions are an innovative finance mechanism that exchanges a portion of a government or organization's debt at more favorable terms, with savings being spent on climate-positive action. Public sector funders guarantee and insure the transaction, enabling private sector lenders to provide cost-effective capital. Debtors benefit from reduced debt service costs and, in the case of nations, optimized debt to GDP ratios, while creditors benefit from sustainable debt repayments and investors from an impactful investment opportunity. In the Galapagos conversion, which CFM facilitated through our marine conservation venture Oceans Finance Company, $1.6 billion in Ecuadorian bonds was exchanged for a $656 million loan, generating Ecuador $1.2 billion in savings via reduced debt service costs. In return, Ecuador will invest $323 million by 2041 on the conservation of the Galapagos and establish a new endowment fund to finance preservation thereafter. The conservation funds will protect a 60,000 square kilometer area called the Hermandad Marine Reserve, protecting marine life from threats, promoting species and population richness, and allowing safe passage for threatened species such as hammerhead sharks, manta rays, sea turtles, and whales. The funds will also help strengthen climate resilience, support sustainable fisheries, and develop a blue economy. Local communities were fundamental to the development process and will be to the conservation. The project will also deliver community benefits and gender and social inclusion opportunities. Each debt for climate conversion is a crucial step closer to achieving the global goal of 30% of the world's lands and waters by 2030 and limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The Galapagos project will help achieve OFC's impact objectives to conserve 800,000 square kilometers, protect 20,000 species, including 1,000 that are endangered, mobilize $50 million funding per conservation area, and improve the lives of 2.5 million people. This historic project sets a new precedent that we intend to replicate in other markets worldwide. A cutting-edge climate solution that will help end the climate crisis.
So that's the Climate Fund's promotional video talking about this huge deal. And it places, from the perspective of the Climate Fund, the focus mostly on what the money will be used for. And the conversation with the Belizean Minister of Environment and the folks from the Nature Conservancy was really all about how the money happens. And so the fact is both sides of the debt for nature swap are complicated and require some thought in order to really understand and appreciate. So let's start with sort of like just a basic first question. Is in your view, is the debt for nature swap a viable option for the Bahamas?
I think so. As the Nature Conservancy folks earlier, talking about the Belize swap, but also hearing about the Climate Fund, discussion on Ecuador. So there's several ways to look at these swaps, but I think the one way probably not to look at it is not a magic bullet for reducing debt. So let's just clear that up very early on. Complications with the existing creditors, right? Who are maybe not just banks, but institutional investors. And so it's not that easy to negotiate a discount from those creditors. So in the case of Belize, for example, I think when they did the swap, they offered something. They offered the original bondholders, this was a super bond that Belize had, they offered those original bondholders 55 cents on the dollar. So that's quite a discount, right? So if you were the bondholder, you were expecting 100 cents on the dollar. But given that Belize was either had let's say Belize was in a position where they couldn't repay and they were about to default, getting 55 cents on the dollar makes more sense than getting zero on the dollar, right? So in a sense, you're kind of forced into accepting the deal. So that's the first complication. And then the second thing I want to say is Belize debt to GDP ratio at the time was something like 125%. This swap only reduced it by about 12% of GDP, right? So that's why I'm saying it's not a magic bullet. I think it's a very useful instrument because it does a couple of things in the process of even an announcement. It raises awareness about the need for conservation and environmental protection. That's the first, I think, to me, a very important objective. But also, if you can negotiate with a subset of your creditors, right? And I would say in our case, in the case of the Bahamas, it's probably easier to do it with either bilateral creditor like UK or Canada if we have any debt to them, or a multilateral institution if that's part of their arsenal. Some don't like to, they don't like to do that because it sounds like a restructuring, and restructuring is always kind of a bad word for economists and for people who manage these things. Also, financial investors and credit rating agencies get a little spooked when they hear you're going to do restructuring. That's why it's very important that when we talk about our debt, and we've made a couple of mistakes in the recent past, we don't use that word restructuring because restructuring means something very specific in financial markets. So I think, this is a very long answer to your question, Quincy. Mm-hmm. I think, yes, there are benefits to be had around awareness raising about the importance of our environment, which absolutely we have to protect. And if you haven't had the pleasure of taking a boat cruise in Long Island through some mangroves, you need to do that. And then you'll really see why it's worth protecting our natural environment, because mangroves are natural sea defenses. They will keep, in the event of a hurricane, they will hold back the sea from coming into the land. And that's why they're such an important part of our for small island development states, especially ones that are low-lying like the Bahamas, where, it's not like we're not a Jamaica where you take shelter in the hills. We don't have hills. Mm. So when the sea level starts to rise, oh my goodness, it's just going to rise, and it's going to threaten all of the physical assets that are on our coastal areas. And we're all low-lying. So everything really, think about what Dorian did in Abaco and Grand Bahama, God forbid, that repeats itself anytime soon. But we don't have, and I'm saying this very categorically and with a lot of emphasis, we don't have enough protection from sea level rise at the moment. And so I think debt to nature swap could help us get some resources to do it. So bottom line, yes, but let's not overplay or oversell what it is that this kind of debt operation can do. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I thought was interesting at the end of the Belize conversation was the reference to the importance of political risk insurance or credit enhancement.
Exactly.
And the thing that the PM mentioned when he talked about the government considering the debt for nature swap sort of process is the fact that there are loans that the CDB has, that the IDB has, and he's considering hundreds of millions in loans from these to perhaps try to offset through some sort of a debt for nature swap.
Right.
But those agencies will have to find ways to make our credit attractive in that instance.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just so that your listeners understand what that means. It's sort of like getting a credit guarantee, because the IDB has AAA credit rating. If the IDB were to offer a credit guarantee to a sovereign like the Bahamas, that reduces the cost of our borrowing, because let's say we're trying to borrow from a bank on capital markets like JP Morgan or Credit Suisse or one of these guys. Well, Credit Suisse doesn't exist anymore, right? Yeah, I have to stop saying that. Let's say we wanted to raise funds from JP Morgan, which is a good example because IDB did one of these with Ecuador. Now that you mention them, what it does, it lowers the cost of borrowing for the Bahamas. So that makes a ton of sense because given our high levels of debt to GDP right now, that is quite expensive. I mean, this is the most expensive the Bahamas debt has been in a while, but that's because rating agencies have already been factoring in our climate change risks. So, and that's happening all over the world, by the way. So there is no investor now that's not looking at their investments through a climate change lens. So that will be priced in. So if it looks like, the probability that the Bahamas will be hit by another hurricane in, let's say, 2 years, 3 years, whatever, that kind of risk gets priced into the return on investment that any, bond, any lender is going to want to provide to the Bahamas. So going through a credit enhancement like the IDB to get a guarantee makes a lot of sense, or the CDB makes a lot of sense. In the case of Belize, they had a guarantee from the U.S. government through, what's the name of the agency? The Development Finance Corporation of the U.S. So that helps. That helped. That always makes it more attractive for the investor because it means that in the event that Belize, in that case, couldn't come up with the resources, then the U.S. entity would provide the resources to do it. So, and in the case, and that's the same thing with the IDB, God forbid that the Bahamas got into a situation where we couldn't repay our debt, then on behalf. So that's why credit enhancements are really pretty handy. But I think the biggest benefit comes in lower cost funds for the country. And we really need that desperately because I think we're paying way too much on our debt. We never used to be in this kind of position. I think it started changing after 2008 with the economic crisis, and then things got worse after Hurricane Dorian, and then with the pandemic and the fact that, the country wasn't growing for a couple of years during the pandemic. So, that can change, and that will change, especially with successive budgets that administrations put in place. And I was happy to see, for example, segueing right into the Bahamas new budget, that the Prime Minister really put a lot of emphasis on a debt to GDP ratio that is on a declining trend as opposed to increasing trend. But that will involve a lot of changes in our macro fiscal management. I know Bahamians are very averse to any increase in taxes, but to be honest, we have one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios in the region, and that's not sustainable if we really want to be kind of country that provides the services, the education, the healthcare that we need, and also the kinds of infrastructure we need. We need more revenue, especially when the expenditures have been rising quite considerably over the last few years. And of course, a lot of that was due to COVID and paying off huge welfare payments to people who lost jobs during COVID and so on. But I think we have to fix that equation, right? We have to figure out, well, there are two ways of fixing it. You either grow the economy fast so that the denominator is getting bigger, while the numerator, the debt or the taxes or the expenditures, those are contained. But we haven't seen that. I mean, it's very difficult, in my opinion, looking at a lot of fiscal accounts across this region over decades, that once you start spending money, it's really hard to rein it in, especially when we basically can't. And especially in our case, because if you look at this, the big ticket items really are wages and salaries and debt service. And these tend to be what we call rigid expenditures, meaning they don't go down, they only go up.
Exactly.
So the only way to tackle that then is to, grow the base, which is to grow the economy so that we can taxes, so we can have more revenues. But sometimes that's also difficult depending on what's happening globally. And right now, I must say, the World Bank report that came out last week, I think it was just on Friday. I've been reading it all weekend because I'm doing something on it. But the outlook has been, everything's been revised downwards, meaning that 23 actually, compared to forecasts that came out in January of this year, they have now, global forecasts for growth are coming down. And Latin America and the Caribbean, probably one of the worst in terms of performing regions around the world. And there are lots of reasons for that. But I say that to say that in terms of how much more economic activity we can generate between now and the end of the year is in question. Although one of the highlights of the report is that tourism-based economies are seeing, an uptick, and we're definitely seeing that. But again, I think most of the growth in the Bahamas tourism, at least in the data, is on the cruise side. And I keep saying this 10,000 times. I've said it in the last year, I think, is that, I wouldn't pay too much attention to cruise visitors because we are spending more money on them.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're spending more money on keeping them, having them come and have a nice port or whatever. And I'm happy that the new port is open now, and that makes a lot of sense in terms of our reputation, because when cruise visitors have a bad experience on Bay Street or wherever they go, they tend to write about it and tweet about it, and it gets broadcast as a general Bahamian horrible experience, and we can't afford that. And by the way, if there are 5 million of them in a year, that's a lot of opportunities to do damage to the reputation of the country. So, I would say bye-bye cruise. I would limit the amount of cruise passengers we have. First, you will enhance the experience. No point having 25,000 people dumped onto Bay Street in a period of a couple of hours. And, in no kind of situation is that a happy one, right? Because we don't have enough things for them to do, or services or restaurants that could absorb that many people in a short space of time.
And every time we try to build it, for whatever reason, something steps in.
Right. So it's not, that, and we should, I don't know how many heads it'll take to actually get that message across, but that's not a good model. That's a bad business. That's what we call a bad business model. What you want to spend money on is making sure that those visitors, the 1.5 million who come and stay in hotels, that they have a good experience, that they are enjoying those properties, that they spend their money on whatever in the country, and that's what we want, right? Because those are the folks who are spending money where the jobs can be created more easily and where we can generate more revenue. Because every time they go to a restaurant, they take a cab, they buy something, they go visit a museum, whatever they do, that's a quality experience versus, oh my God, 25,000 trying to get down the rickety sidewalks on Bay Street or experiencing some terrible thing on our Key. So I think we have to do better there, and I think we can. We have that potential because we're so creative, and Bahamians really know how to have a good time and do things in an excellent way when the opportunity presents itself. So that's what I would say.
Yep.
I would say on the budget side, yeah.
So you said you said a ton just now, and I really want to interact with some of the things you said.
Okay.
But first and foremost, what I want to get at is, well, let's look at the prime minister's budget statement, right? He in the context of the debt for nature swap, he pointed out that the Caribbean Development Bank has a portfolio of 7 loans valued at $111.4 million.
It's a drop in the bucket. It's a drop in the bucket compared to our total debt, right? So it's very small. But it's not trivial.
No. The IDB has a portfolio of 23 loans valued at 836.
Yeah, much more substantive. Correct.
So together, that's $948 million of debt.
Right.
And those two agencies are the ones that are apparently the ones he's considering approaching with regard to the debt for nature swap. But there's not much more in the budget speech about it.
Yeah. So
aside from an explanation of what a debt for nature swap is, which is fine.
Yeah. So I think
we kind of have to. Mm-hmm. Sorry, go ahead. No, after you.
No. I think that's a nice chunk, right? That's close to $1 billion. I think the Bahamas debt stock now is close to $3 billion.
I believe.
Dollars. It's certainly around 70% of GDP, right? So our GDP is around 11 billion. They'll do the math. Yeah, it's about that. So I think it's a good idea, but I would be quite surprised if it's possible to do it on the multilateral debt alone, just because. And I've worked at the IDB for 9 years, so there hasn't been a debt for nature swap on multilateral debt that I'm aware of. So that would have to be something that would take a lot of negotiation, Quincy. I wouldn't put all my eggs in that basket. I would go after, and even CDB. Because unless we can get kind of similar deal, Belize, say from the U.S. financing corporation, to do a guarantee, but where the guarantees, in our view, in my mind, where the guarantees would come from would be the CDB, would be the IDB, right? So the IDB isn't about to guarantee a discount on its own debt. I mean, that doesn't make sense. And for that to happen, all the shareholders would have to agree. And I think that could be long and sloppy as an exercise. I would go after bilateral debt if we had any, and, any big bonds that are held by, whether it's JP Morgan or some other big
right. I mean, those are,
investment.
You can make a case for those, I think.
Yeah.
But just to address our math, to use the numbers in the PM's own budget statement, the central government debt is now a total of $11.1 billion.
11.1 billion.
Yes.
Well, yeah, that's close to. I thought our GDP was like 11 billion, but that's close to 100% of GDP then.
Yeah.
I thought it was less.
So
in the budget,
according to him, it's 87% of GDP.
Okay, so our GDP is more than 11, probably like 15 billion. Okay, so but that's a huge chunk, right? That's a lot of money, and I can guarantee you that won't be solved with the debt for nature swap. It's too much.
1 billion. But is 1 billion still worth it?
1 billion is still worth it. I think 1 billion is still worth it. The only thing is he picked 2 multilateral banks, and it'll be difficult for those institutions to agree to do that unless there's some guarantee. For example, right now IDB does not have a debt forgiveness strategy, right? So if you remember, I don't know, maybe you're too young for this, but in the 2000s.
It's so
no, you're not too young for this. You're not too young for this, but about the IMF, the World Bank at the time, was something called HIPC, which was highly indebted poor countries. So only low-income countries were getting debt relief. The only country in our region that got it was Guyana, and I want to say Dominica may have gotten a little bit as well. But these were countries that, one, had no access to capital markets, and they were heavily indebted, and the idea was to liberate the budget in a way, funds would then get reinvested into social development, social and other kinds of development. So that's not our case. And the problem with a country like the Bahamas, which is middle to upper income, we're upper income, by the way. We're, I think, the second after Bermuda. We're probably the richest on a per capita basis country in the region. And it would be very difficult for the shareholders of the World Bank, IMF, IDB to come around to, and this has been the debate, right? This is what the Bridgetown Initiative is all about, by the way, that Prime Minister Motley has been calling for, right? Middle and upper middle income countries, upper and middle income countries in the Caribbean do not have access to debt relief or even concessional financing. Concessional financing basically means a window where you get debt at a reduced rate from these multilateral institutions. So the best we can do, being upper income, is to try to access the new Resilience Trust Fund at the IMF, which Barbados was the second country, I think, to tap into that. So far it's been Costa Rica, Rwanda, Barbados, and one other country in Africa that I'm forgetting, who've accessed this Resilience Trust Fund. And that trust fund is established just to put into climate change, mitigation, adaptation, and so on. Oh, Jamaica was the last one to do it recently. And Jamaica, I think, is tapping almost $1 billion. It's something like 800 and something million under that fund to do specific projects around climate change, adaptation, and mitigation, and natural, all the work that goes into shoring up resilience. So I think that's what we should do. I would go down that route before I went down the route of the debt swap, just because the debt swap is transactions much more expensive. And at the end of the day, as in the case of Belize, you're not really chipping away that much at the stock. And because I mentioned that the two institutions he mentioned are multilateral development banks, that's not going to be an easy thing to get through to their boards. So
yeah.
I want to call it 100% thinking, but it's not going to be easy.
So this is my challenge, right? Is you there's no gentle way to say this, right? So I'm just going to say it and pay the price as is necessary.
Okay.
If I can reach you and have this conversation, I imagine you've had such conversations with government policymakers. It seems to me that is this a case of tossing everything up on the wall and seeing what sticks, or because 1%, less than 1 billion out of an $11.1 billion government debt is, it's not insignificant. I don't want to suggest.
No, it's not insignificant. But what is the bigger question is the buy-in from the multilaterals that you chose to do this with. And I don't know of any previous debt for nature swap at the IDB or at CDB that's happened. So I'm not saying it can't. And anything novel is going to take some time to negotiate. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. It's. And I appreciate I appreciate the. How do I say this? I appreciate the desire for innovation, right?
No, absolutely. No, and I think. Well, look, I think so. There is still a hangover of negativity around going to the IMF for anything. And I keep trying to say to folks, whoever would listen, that the IMF is no longer the boogeyman, right? Think of it, and I was trying to come up with a nice analogy before this program started. It's sort of like if you want to buy a house, you don't you don't use up all the savings in your savings account to do it. What you do is you go and get a mortgage, because a house is a long-term investment and you can spread those payments out over a long period. That's the theory around. Think of the IMF as kind of like a mortgage, right? What we need to do is reduce the debt as quickly as possible. And let's call the Resilience Fund a kind of a mortgage on a future house building in the country more resilient. Change. So that's the house we want to buy. We want to buy this house that has all the coastal management in it, all the disaster preparedness in it, all of the maybe even whatever we need to do to get renewable energy and reduce our fossil fuel and our greenhouse gas emissions footprint. All of that stuff can be in this new house. So that's why you would go to the Resilience Trust. It's like a mortgage. We're going to do this. We're going to get this money from the fund to do that with. This is not the IMF telling you, okay, and because you're coming to us, you have to do things in this particular way. The policies are there as guidance, right? It's to help the country get to where it wants to be. And by the way, if you don't need any other example of what can happen in, I think it's a short space of time when I look at Jamaica being able to slash its debt to GDP ratio from 150 to now 70, just under, I think it's 77% of GDP right now. That's a phenomenal achievement. But because they put a lot of effort into fiscal consolidation, putting in a fiscal rule, no Minister of Finance can come and wreak havoc with the people's budget, meaning taxpayers, because now you have a rule that says, well, you know what, the deficit has to be X, the debt has to be Y, and we have to be on this path of lowering the debt to GDP to make sure we meet that target. And what happens when you have a clear rule is that everybody's aware of it. Domestic investors are aware, international investors are aware, credit rating agencies are looking on in astonishment and saying, wow, look at what they've done in a short space of time. Yes, we will upgrade their credit rating. And by the way, we're very happy to see that they've now gone to the Resilience Trust Fund to do stuff on climate change, because now we have been pricing in climate risk into credit ratings. And if you want to borrow abroad or you want to borrow anywhere, people will take note of these issues. So this isn't trivial business, right? This is really serious. And the world is a really difficult place right now because, first of all, we're trying to pull ourselves out of this awful pandemic. We still have this war going on in Ukraine, so inflation and supply chain issues are still a big issue. We are paying far for goods and services in the Bahamas than we should. The one thing that I know consistently that every Bahamian thinks about is what they pay for electricity on a monthly basis. I saw something today where people are saying, oh my God, my BPL bill is, how does that make sense? That makes sense in a country where there is sunshine basically 365 days a year, right? Let's say you have a couple of rainy days, but in essence, we ought to be using more renewable energy. We ought to be weaning ourselves off fossil fuels, and we ought to be to mobility and what that means and how we can migrate into these cleaner, more efficient cars. But it's not clear. The government has not stated what its renewable energy targets are. It hasn't said anything about electric mobility in this budget. And it just leaves open any sort of question that an international investor would have about where the country is headed. It raises a lot of questions, right? And I don't understand how we participate in some of these energy conferences year after year after year after year. We know what's going on with climate change. We have actually made commitments at the UN level. They're called NDCs, nationally determined commitments, to meet those targets by a certain date. But I don't see effort on the ground to do that. Now, it's hard. It's not easy to make these very difficult changes, especially when you're trying to convince the population that the benefit is in the future. And as we know, as human beings, we want the benefit now. We don't want the benefit in the future, right? That's human nature. But as policymakers, your job is to convince your population that in the future, this is going to be better for everyone. So you put in incentives for people to have solar panels on their homes. You change the way approvals are given for new buildings to make sure that water harvesting is included, that solar panels are included, if only for water heating, this kind of thing. These are like very simple policy tweaks to make, but in the long run, the benefit's huge. And you also now create new avenues for work and economic opportunities. Whether it's people who we can manufacture solar panels like they do in Barbados. Why don't we have a manufacturing plant in the Bahamas to produce solar panels? You have engineers who can now know everything about how do you do energy storage and how do you have these new lithium batteries in your homes where you can store the energy that your solar panels are generating. And this is really basic. I sound like I'm saying a lot of sophisticated things, but these are really basic things now. The technology has been around for years, but we're not doing it, or we're doing it for decades. And the price has come down on these panels, photovoltaics and so on. You know, in Jamaica now, there are wind farms. You drive through some part of the country and, you know, there are at least 2 or 3 big wind farm, I don't know what you call it, wind farms that are generating electricity.
They call them wind farms, yes.
Yeah, with wind turbines, right? So that's just a new landscape. I don't think we have one turbine in the whole of the Bahamas. I don't think I've ever seen one. So so just to finish the point on electricity and the cost of electricity, the cost of electricity is such a stranglehold on everything we do. It affects competitiveness. It affects the cost of our tourism product. It affects our transportation costs. It affects if we want to do any manufacturing. It affects everything, right? Because we can't live without electricity. It affects whether we can get onto the internet. With no electricity, we can't do that. So you can see how this would be something, if I were any kind of person in the government, I would focus on this with like laser attention to and the generation of electricity and the type of energy we want to produce. We have an archipelago where the family islanders, poor folks, you know, are very unreliable energy. But that's because BPL cannot afford to put in infrastructure on all these islands. Imagine if we just had renewable energy on each of those islands. Because populations are small, you can do it there. You don't have to think about the kind of scale we need on New Providence, where we've got all of these massive hotels and buildings using air conditioning all day long. So we just need to think about what it's called an integrated resource plan would be for our energy needs and do it properly. And by the way, the IDB is more than willing and able and ready to help do that. I think it is doing that, for example, with the rebuilding of Abaco and some initiatives in Grand Bahama. But this is the future. And, you know, this is not really, it's not rocket science. It just makes sense. And we're going to reduce the cost of electricity, and Bahamians can stop, you know, bellyaching about their electricity bill every month and stop worrying about whether they're going to have lights, you know, in the middle of the summer when we know that BPL has to do load shedding and all that. So there's plenty there, Quincy, that we need to focus on. I didn't see much on that in the budget.
No.
I don't know. Yeah.
So listen, all right. Now, I know that you have to exit stage left at some time in the next few minutes. Right. But overall, I want to ask you a question, right? Given the things that you have said, what would be basic policy proposals that are not, these do not strain the imagination, nor do they strain the bounds of reality. These are things that can and should be and should have been done. The question has to be, why are we in this position?
Okay, so I knew this was going to come up, and I was also thinking about how I would respond to this. So
it's a hard one to ask. But
it's difficult. So I'm going to answer it this way, and I'm going to say that there are vested interests that are involved in the oil business, call it Shell, Texaco, whatever. There are Bahamian investors and capitalists who are heavily invested in those companies. And the problem is with BPL and the way we've done contracts for oil, these are long-term contracts that have been negotiated, I don't know. And this is what oil companies do. Oil companies like to lock you in, and for good reason now, because they know that the world generally is moving away from fossil fuels. So if they find happening. So this is where, again, unless the administration has the wherewithal to say we're going to stand up to the fossil fuel industry and we're going to break this way of doing business, it's not going to happen. And I'm sad to say that I haven't seen anything lately that convinces me that we're on that track. And it's not just, by the way, it's not just the Bahamas, right? But if you want to get a real sense of urgency around the fossil fuel industry, follow Antonio Guterres, who is the UN Secretary General. And he has basically said that policymakers and governments around the globe have been taking shortcuts because basically they are in the pockets, no, not literally, but you know what I mean, of the oil industry. And that needs to stop. And that can only stop when citizens start to ask questions, right? And I think Bahamians have been asking these questions for a long time. Why am I paying so much for electricity? So that's a reasonable question that any government would want to answer. And someone has to, at some point, say, we have to stop importing fuel and we need to break these contracts. And by the way, you know, Shell and Texaco and these oil companies that we do business with, they're also in the business of trying to come up with clean energy. And we need to say to them, well, if you want to do business with the Bahamas, we need your clean energy version. We need natural gas or we need something else. We cannot be running diesel to fuel a small island development state that is vulnerable to climate change and it's having, you know, all these negative effects on the planet. So that's a tough one. But essentially that's what we need to do.
Yeah. So I have a couple of other things that I want to say, but I'm going to give my space to this caller who I think has this person wants to get in on the conversation. So I'll let him have the last word so that I can let you go.
Sure.
Caller, you are live on Political Review. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon. It has been very good discussion. I was looking at the first point that you mentioned that we need to increase revenue. And I thought that we need to deal with the efficient use of revenue rather than just the increase of revenue. Then follow up, there was a point that was made about the cap on the cruise visitors. And I thought that was very remarkable. But whether we have the stomach to do that. And there was a lot of things that were spoken of. But once upon a time, we heard about Inago would have been a solo island. And I don't know what has become of that. So these are the things that we're talking of, which will help us, but we haven't done other things that could take us forward. So I think we're caught in a... But I have another question quickly. What do you think of the impact of the informal economy, and what is our income spread? The very poor, the very rich, and what percentage is in the very middle?
Those are really good questions.
Great questions. Thank you very much.
Really good questions. Just quickly on the revenue side. Yeah. So when we talk about revenue and needing to improve it, I'm just talking about the overall revenue to GDP. I think the Bahamas is still like maybe even under 20% of GDP, whereas a country of Bahamas size should be like 23, 24, 25% of GDP in terms of revenue. And the reason why is because our revenue base is very narrow. We don't tax income. And we have a bunch of what I call paying taxes, stamp duties, and things that really, in the long run, don't make a lot of sense. But the reason why we did that is because, remember, the Bahamas has services by peddling itself as a not tax-free, not a completely tax-free, but income tax-free environment, a low-tax environment. So, and that's been attacked all over the place by the OECD and others and so on. But
isn't that also a lie? But anyway, go ahead.
It is. I mean, I don't want to go into tax competition as per se, but the point he's making is, yes, we need to think about, and that's why we talked about efficiency of expenditures and making sure that what we're spending on makes sense. So getting value for dollar, for example, in government procurement. So when we do a project, an infrastructure project, make sure there's no waste, make sure there's no nobody's getting 10% of a project. And we know that this happens all across the globe, that depending on, the political power in place, procurements end up in the wrong places with people who have absolutely no qualifications to deliver on those procurements. But this is how the world works. And so if that's going to happen, at least have a mechanism in place where those contractors are being held accountable. So if something goes awry, you can rein them in or get them to fix whatever they didn't do properly and so on. Some countries like Jamaica has an office of the contractor general. His sole job is to monitor government contracts to make sure, even if there's hanky-panky, and we know there's hanky-panky everywhere, that those contractors will be held to account as much as possible to make sure the taxpayer gets value for money. So that's the thing. On the issue of what's the poverty rates in the Bahamas? And we know that we have a lot of income inequality. I don't have the latest Gini coefficient, that's the measure of what our income inequality is, except to say that we know the quintiles of the income spectrum, the bulk of Bahamians are middle income by the very nature of our GDP per capita being something like $30,000. It means that you have a huge spread, right? You've got the ones who are making lots of money and ones who are not making that much money. But on average, I think we're not doing badly as a upper middle income country. And of course, a lot of the dispersion in income inequality is seen, especially in the Family Islands, just because they don't have the infrastructure, education not as great, and populations are small. So economic activity is very sparse in some of those places. This, we can talk all day, but Quincy, I need to go. And I think some of those issues you can raise with him as well. But thank you very much again for having me, and I'm happy to join you sometime in the future. All right, take care.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Bye. Bye, listeners. Bye, listeners. Bye-bye. Thank you.
All righty. Thank you so much. Folks, that's Therese Turner-Jones. She is presently serving as a private consultant based out of Jamaica, formerly an executive at both the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank Group. Incredibly talented, experienced international economist and author, and someone whose views I think should be taken with a great deal of seriousness. We're going to go ahead and take I guess let's call this our last break, Chris. I don't know, but we'll take a short break now, and we'll be right back on the Political Review with K. Quincy Parker. You're tuned into Guardian. It's 36 minutes after. Is it 36 minutes after? No, it's 37 minutes after 5 o'clock. So we'll see you again in a short while.
I'm talking about the man upstairs. Tired of paying too many bills and loan payments each month?
Shrink your monthly debt payments down to one easy payment with our debt consolidation loan.
It also has a built-in savings that pays you 5% interest.
Inquire about our debt consolidation loans today.
Call 356-7764.
Sign up now for the Michael Scooter and Peace on the Streets Basketball Classic, taking place July 24 to the 30th at the Hope Center and the Candlelight Exchange. Call 601-4842 for more information. Powered by the Bryce Newbold Foundation. It's game time.
When faced with an illness like cancer, we band together, and we at Cleveland Clinic in Florida have your back. From advanced cancer treatments to extra safety measures at all of our locations, we're with you on this journey. For every infusion and follow-up, for every step of the way, for every care in the world. Cleveland Clinic in Florida. Get the care you need when and where you need it. To learn more or connect with a local representative, visit clevelandclinic.org/Caribbean.
This is Guardian Radio 96.9 FM. Fresh News, Smart Talk.
Ladies and gentlemen, to the Political Review with me, your host, Quincy Parker. If you're into Guardian Talk Radio 96.9 FM, we're also streaming live on www.guardiantalkradio.com. You can call us at 323-6232 or 325-4259. You can text us at 422-4799. No, that's not right. 47. Is it 4799? Why doesn't that feel right? That doesn't feel right. Let me see. What's the text number again? 422-4769. What? No, 96. Good gracious. I should be ashamed of myself. I've known that for nearly going on 9 years now. 422-4796. I wrote down 99. I'm not sure why. I apologize. Therese Turner-Jones, international economist, had some incredibly, I think, provocative things to say about the state of government finances and the government's financial policy in the current economy, the current moment in time. One of the things that I think that she started to address, which I find I'm happy that someone of her stature, and experience on the international arena would have said it, because it sort of validates almost in its entirety my own view of the shortcomings of our tourism product and our tourism policy. We celebrate 7 million visitors to the Bahamas a year, but 5.5 million of them are cruise visitors who we know barely spend any money in the country, and who we also know don't have the best time in the country, and therefore are the source of the majority of international complaints about the Bahamas. They're the ones who barely have time to come off the ship. They're the ones who's experienced people on the ship even while they're off of it. They're the ones who don't spend any money in the community because they're told not to, or because they find no reason compelling enough to part with their hard-earned money that they saved and scrimped and worked for, that we seem to believe that they should part with just because we want it. And so I find it very compelling, this concept that the country should limit the number of cruise visitors allowed in. I don't know that you can limit the number of allowed in, but I guess you could. And why shouldn't we? Why shouldn't we work to rebalance the percentage of tourists who come to the Bahamas via the different modes of travel? And I know that the Ministry of Tourism and all of the tourism boosting agencies, the promotional boards and whatever else have you, all the tourism officers who work around the world have worked very hard to increase it. When you look at what has been done downtown, for instance, right? The work that has gone into the downtown port, the Nassau Harbor, so to speak, does not seem to have been matched by the work on the airports or the work on boosting the hotel or the air travel experience, the experience of the air traveler. All the focus is on improving downtown for the cruise visitor, creating things for cruise visitors to do. And I mean, listen, there's 5.5 million of those people. It makes sense. I'm not saying it doesn't make sense. But, and I accept that it's private investment in the cruise business that's driving the majority of that investment. I get all of that. I accept it. But what I can't accept is that there is no upside for private investment to invest equally or more so in the more lucrative air travel business. That's what I can't accept, that we seem to have abandoned that sector, our tourism product, because it's just easier to focus on the cruise business. And that is so because it's made easier to focus on them because they're the majority, the vast majority. And as I say, I get that, but I think that another thing that Therese said that I really feel resonating still with me is that the job of the government is to make decisions that have impact not just in the present moment, but to make decisions that have future benefits that will accrue to the community, to the society, to the country. And if we continue to focus almost exclusively on cruise business, as we seem to be doing from a government perspective, then we risk becoming a destination, in my view, take advantage of its full potential as a tourism destination. But if we're satisfied with the cruise ship money, if that's as far as our vision can take us, then I guess that's where we'll be. That's that's what we'll do. That's what we'll have. It just doesn't feel like that's right or enough to me. I feel like we're missing things there. Therese talked a little bit about, when I asked the question why we're in this position, she talked about the energy sector, I appreciate and certainly agree with what she said. But my question was actually a little more broad than dealing with one sector in particular. I guess, and the caller sort of raised the question as well in terms of efficiency of use of government revenue. But the question as to why we're in this position, to me, is tied into this story that we have sold around the world and that we have tied around our own necks, that we're a tax-free jurisdiction, right? And trying to figure out how we can structure a tax system to make the best use of the income, the revenue that is generated in the country. And I don't believe that Bahamians cannot pay a tax. I refuse to believe that, and I'll tell you why. I remember in 2013, when the Christie administration started, was it a Christie? Yeah, they started talking about implementing a value-added tax, Christie PLP. Prior to that, the conversation had been happening, of course, around the Ministry of Finance tables. I mean, it goes back. Everybody by now, if you've had this discussion with anyone in the journalism sector, you will have heard about the white paper produced by William Allen, presenting different options to Hubert Ingram for what an introduction of a tax would look like in the Bahamas, whether it would be a value-added tax, whether it be an income tax, whatever the case may be. And I remember the discussion revolving around whether or not the economy was robust enough for Bahamians to pay a tax, whether or not Bahamians afford to pay a tax. The instinctual argument was no, because we thought at the time that the Bahamas' economy was about an $8 billion economy. I remember that number very distinctly. And I remember the conversation about the tax being introduced with the initial number, I believe, as proposed by Bill Allen, was 15%. And initially, that was the number proposed by the Christie administration. And just before the introduction of the tax, about a year before, the pressure was sufficiently strong that the administration chose to implement the tax at 7.5%. Half of what was recommended. And keeping in mind that what was recommended as a way of making it rational to have the tax in the first place. So if my understanding is correct, the point of having the tax in the first place set at 15% was that was the rational figure in terms of a percentage that would have the kind of outturn that would make imposing a tax sensible in the first place. So personally, I cannot understand having the courage to implement the tax, but only at half the recommended percentage. And then subsequent to that, the minister had the audacity to raise the tax, but not all the way to the recommended 15%. So what I would love to hear from any political administration is whether or not, number one, 15% is the right percentage. Number two, why not just go to 15% one time? And here's why I say it. For all of the crying about whether or not Bahamians could pay a tax, 6 months after the value-added tax was introduced on January 1st, 2015, the tax had already earned $180 million. And in the first year of the introduction of the value-added tax, it overperformed. The tax overperformed. John Roll was then the governor of the central bank. His estimate was that the tax would earn about $150 million for the government. The tax earned $386 million, I believe that's the number, $386 million in its first year. So much so that Mike Alkidas and I, when I asked him this question about how could the tax have overperformed so egregiously, had to come back and say, well, we thought the economy was an $8 or $9 billion economy. It's actually closer to $12 billion, right? So just this idea of we can't afford to put a tax on the back of the Bahamian people was proved a lie right away by the overperformance of the tax to such an extent that if they had put it in at 15% in that first year, it would have earned $300 million anyway. Of course, that would have been John Roll's estimate. If his estimate at half was 150, then his estimate of the whole would have been double that, 300. And even so, it overperformed by almost $100 million more than that, almost $90 million more than that. So why are we here? Why are we still trying to deal with government debt of $11.1 billion, according to the Prime Minister, with these measures that only peck around the outside of the debt? Now, I support blue bonds. I think personally that it is an innovation. The debt for nature swap is an innovative step, and I applaud the Davis administration for taking it. I think that the Prime Minister should do more than just consider it. I think he should pursue it religiously, and I think he should get it done. And I'll be the first one applauding from the top of the hill if it happens. But it's less than $1 billion out of an $11.1 billion debt stock. So we have to do more. We have to do more. On the Political Review, my name is Quincy Parker. It's a pleasure to speak to you.
Yes, Mr. Parker, I'm back, and my name is Randolph Bowlen. Yes, sir. I'm taking off the salient points that your former guest, your guest made. She made a good sell on the IMF, which is very interesting. I didn't hear you repeat that, but I am really calling about the tax that you.
I talked to her about the IMF before.
Right, the tax that you were saying, and the ability of our society to handle the tax and the overperformance of the tax. Now, something of this. When the tax, as it were, overperformed itself, it just meant that the estimate was off, as I think you did mention that perhaps this is not an 8 billion economy, with a 12 billion economy. But that doesn't necessarily say that the public has an appetite to pay taxes, because it's a compulsory tax. What Caesar say, you must give Caesar. You don't have a choice, So that doesn't mean that we can handle more tax and tax and tax.
But you said two very different things there just now, Colin.
I'm listening.
You said, in the first instance, you talked about an appetite to pay a tax. And then in the second instance, you talked about an ability to pay the tax. Those are two different things.
Yeah. I don't, because remember I asked about the spread, the income spread. The ability to pay the tax also, because if we have, if in my estimation, I'm thinking that we have a lot of people on the lower spectrum, the ability to pay the tax will not be. I mean, the little person be paying the same amount of tax as those who have much. It's just that may be a good way to go. Pay according to how you earn, and let those who are those who are very wealthy pay a better share, not the widows might. But
I appreciate your point.
I would like us to involve all our economists, including Peter Blair and everybody, bring them all on the table, and that we move this country forward, including using up all the minds. I want to underscore one other thing that was mentioned about the role of the finance minister. I think they mentioned that somewhere in Jamaica, there is something that the finance minister could do and something they cannot do, because the system was set that an incoming finance minister or a new government cannot just change things over the, by circumstances right away without following the guidelines or within a certain parameter. And lastly, I would like to know if your program is recorded and stored in the archive on the website, so that others can have access to it and use and review and preview this material once again to the benefit of the country.
That's very kind of you. Yes, the show is recorded and stored on the Guardian Talk Radio website. That's www.guardiantalkradio.com. And you would just go to the podcast section and go to the Political Review with Quincy Parker podcast. The show will be up by 1 or 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, and that's where it will live there for the next little while. The Bahamas' Gini coefficient that she mentioned, 3 as of 2019, 53.3, which means 0 meaning the country has a perfect equality in terms of wealth distribution, and 100 represents perfect inequality. And so at 53.3, we are middling in terms of wealth distribution in the country, leaning towards more inequality than equality. So that is something that we will have to continue to pay close attention to. We're over by a minute, and I apologize to Lady T. So as much as there's more to say, we're going to have to stop it there. And Christoph, thank you for riding with me today. You did a great job. Thank you very much to all the listeners, and thank you to the callers. And we will see you next week. There's a change on the horizon, folks. So we'll see you next week. You're tuned in to Guardian Talk Radio 96.9 FM. I'm Quincy Parker. This has been the Political Review. And Let's Talk Together in English is up next with Lady T. I'll see you guys next week.